Hi everybody, it's a nice day in Sherburne, Minnesota at Martin County West, and today is the last day of April and we're already into spring. And the conifers that we're going to look at today are conifers that were all found within a mile or two of the high school at Martin County West. And I know that Mrs. Wooleater has had a number of you looking at some of the taxonomy of conifers. And so we're going to look today at some of the identifying features that conifers have. And we're going to start out and we're going to follow the directions and the order that was presented in this text. And that's the same text that Mrs. Wooleater had for you that she gave to you online. So we're going to start out with the ones that are that have leaves that are either spiny or awl-shaped. And the first one of these is this one here that's called a red cedar. And if you notice, red cedar, the seeds of red cedar are very, very tiny. And this is the seed that's eaten by birds, and it's spread throughout southern Minnesota. And if you ever drive to Fairmont on Interstate 90, which I'm sure most of you do, there's a spot that has cedar trees growing on the south side of Interstate 90. There's also Cedar Park, which has got thousands and thousands of these red cedars growing. Red cedars are a tree that are native, though they're almost decidedly a pest now in Minnesota. But if you look at the leaves themselves, and we consider all of these to be leaves, there's these little awl-shaped, which are little tiny little needles, which are located, are little spines that are located on the stem. So if you reach in and touch this, you're going to probably, especially if you get on these stems, you're going to feel a rough coating on there. These stay green all summer and all winter long. They do not shed their needles. They are a shrub that is grown and is hybridized and used in landscaping as well as occurs in nature. Another one of the awl or spine-shaped cedars is northern white cedar. And these leaves look very flat in nature. So if I lay this out on my hand, it almost looks like it's been pressed in a book. And this is very soft and it does not have spines at all. And this tree, which occurs naturally, has been hybridized, and it's sometimes called arborvitae. And this is a shade-loving, so it's very shade-tolerant. And if it had its druthers in nature, it would rather grow in northern Minnesota in a very shady, wet, boggy condition. And the roots of this, I have a friend of mine who makes native birch bark canoes, and he'll use the roots from this plant to lace through the birch bark itself. It's again a tree that's natural. It's very shade tolerant and occurs in Minnesota. The next one we're going to look at, this is the only deciduous conifer. Now that sounds almost like a misnomer, but what we mean by a deciduous conifer is that these needles, which are growing in a bundle, and each one of these are a little tiny little bundle. And if you counted out the number of needles in there that are in that bundle, you'd probably find anywhere from 11 to 15 needles that are present. These needles, and what makes this a deciduous tree, is these needles drop every year. So these needles are completely gone. They're just starting out right now, and they will get to be about that long, about an inch long, but they'll always be in clusters. The cone, the seeding body of this shrub, or this tree, excuse me, which is called a tamarack, or sometimes called an eastern larch, is very small in nature. And again, this tree would love to grow in a swamp or boggy area. We've got some growing in town here as landscape trees, but they look rather scruffy, especially in the wintertime when they lose all their leaves. They'll grow from 40 to 50 feet tall, and but if it gets too dry, they don't like real dry conditions. That's the last of the either awl-shaped or spiny-shaped or needles in clusters of 10 or more or 11 or more. And now we'll move into trees that have needles in clusters or in bunches of 2 to 5. And we're going to start with this one right here. And as you can see, I pulled off one cluster of needles, and there are 2 needles in this bundle. This, if we take a look at the buds on this one, you'll see that the new growth is going to come out on the terminal end of all of these. This is a Norway pine or a red pine. Now this red pine has got long needles, very long needles, as you can see here. And the needles, if I press down on the needles aren't real soft, but they're not so stiff that they cause pain in my hand at all. The Norway pine, or as it's known in Minnesota, the red pine, is the Minnesota state tree. It's very, very much used when Minnesota was logged in the 1880s through the 1920s. This was one of the trees that was cut for lots and lots of pine lumber that was used across the United States. Again, this is a Norway pine. Another tree that was logged very heavily and really highly sought after was the eastern white pine. Now, white pine, if I take one of these bundles, and I'm trying to find a bundle here, and we count the number of needles that are present on a bundle, you'll see that there's 5 needles on a bundle. A white pine is reasonably shade tolerant, but the white pine doesn't grow real well in southern Minnesota. It would like to have a moist but well-drained soil. And in southern Minnesota, we have naturally occurring clay soils that retain their moisture because they're high in clay. And sometimes these trees will grow fine for 5 or 10 years and then suddenly die out because they're drowning almost. White pine is sometimes called cork pine. And when the United States was colonized in the 1800s, white pine also occurs in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and northern Minnesota. The white pine was highly sought after because it's a tall, straight-growing tree, and the tree itself was used for masts on sailing ships. And it floated, when the white pine was harvested, it was harvested mostly in the wintertime. The logs were pulled to rivers, and then the logs were floated down the river in huge log drives, and they would be floated down to a sawmill and then harvested. One of the, again, pines, because it's a tree that has needles in bundles, and again, I'm going to pluck one off here, and you can see that there are 2 needles per bundle in this one. This tree was imported from Central and Eastern Europe in the 18 and 1900s, is used for ornamental purposes. And if you notice, these bud ends, and I'm not sure what Mrs. Wooleater calls these bud ends, but I call them candles. But you can see that they're very white and kind of scaly almost in nature. Whereas if you go back and take a look at the red pine, these two, as far as how they're needled, are very much similar to each other. But this one, the terminal bud, is very much a different color. It's kind of a brown color, and it's got all kinds of little points on it, where Austrian pine, and that's what this one is, has got a white candle. You can see these, and they almost shine like beacons when you see them from afar. The other difference is this. If you have these samples that are right next to each other, and if you take your hand and you press down like this, all of a sudden now you can feel a little bit of pain because they're a lot stiffer and sharper in nature. And so they're not going to feel as nice, but these are used quite often as ornamentals. Our last pine that we're going to look at, which again has moderately, not short, but moderately length needles. And again, there's 2 needles in a bundle. And these needles are not straight like they were in the other pines, but are twisted. So there's a pair of needles, and they're twisted. This is a Scotch or Scots pine. Now this pine is used very often for Christmas trees. And along about in July, late June or in July, this pine, Scotch pine, will be sheared with a shearing knife to shape it so that you can have a nice symmetrical looking Christmas tree with a strong leader in the middle, and then it's sheared so that it has the proper angle so it really looks like a Christmas tree should look. That's the last of the pines that we're going to look at. There's one more pine that occurs very often in Minnesota, and that's the jack pine. And we don't have any jack pines that are located in southern Minnesota. Jack pines have 2 needles in a bundle, and those needles are about half as long as the Scotch pine was. But you'll be able to check that out in the booklet, but we're going to move on to the next group.